In January of 1993, the bodies of 3 teenage girls were found. The girls, who had been missing since that prior November, had sparked the fears of an entire nation. Their bodies were found buried in a pit about a kilometer away from the nearest dirt road. All 3 had been murdered by an unknown assailant, all of them showing various signs of torture and rape. While the mystery of who had killed them would go on to dominate the Spanish media for the next decade, the girls themselves were mostly forgotten by the rest of the world. All of their dreams and ambitions died with them, their names now being spoken in hushed voices as cautionary tales for the next generation of teenage girls. A statue of the 3 girls was built and erected at a nearby cemetery, where the remains of the 3 girls were permanently buried. Just as it was in life, the girls found themselves together even in death. The statue, which contains the likeness of each of the victims, stands as a monument to the enduring legacy that the murder of the 3 girls created, and it also stands as an omen to all that visit the small area the girls lived in. That while things may seem fine on the surface, the full story of this horrifying and tragic ordeal has yet to be revealed. This is the story of the Alcasser girls. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and this is the concluding episode of my 5-part series based on the tragic crime of Alcasser. All 3 were teenage girls headed for different paths in life, but united by a longtime friendship. They went missing on a fateful Friday the 13th, in November of 1992. 75 days later, in the latter days of the following January, their bodies were discovered roughly half an hour away from their hometown of Alcasser, in the rolling hills known as La Romana. In part 2, I detailed the police investigation which quickly stumbled upon evidence at the crime scene. A hospital pamphlet with the name of Enrique Inglis. Despite the name on the pamphlet belonging to Enrique, police quickly set their sights on Enrique's brother, Antonio, and one of the Inglis family's friends, Miguel Ricart. Both suspects had histories of crime, although Miguel had never been convicted or charged with a violent crime before. In part 3 of this series, I told you about Antonio Inglis' run away from police as a wanted fugitive. He fled across the country, mostly on foot, and allegedly stowed away on a ship heading out of Lisbon, Portugal. His trail ended just off the coast of Ireland, when Antonio was either pushed off board by the crew or escaped willingly. The story isn't exactly clear. In the last episode, part 4, I told you about the evolving narrative of the crime, put together by the circumstantial evidence and Miguel Ricart's ever-changing confessions. In this episode, I'll tell you about what came after, the trial of Miguel Ricart, and everything else that has unfolded in the years since. Fair warning, it's going to be quite the crazy ride, but before I get started, I'd like to briefly tell you all how you can support the podcast and help bring about more stories just like this one. You can head to iTunes or Apple Podcast and leave the podcast a great review. Honestly, this doesn't seem like a lot, but it goes a long way and it really helps the podcast gain some more listeners. My absolute goal is to make the podcast a weekly show, and any attention helps me get there. If you would like to go any further than that and become a supporter of the podcast, you can head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. There, you could get access to some cool perks, including commercial-free episodes, and helping me decide upcoming stories for the podcast. You can also head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me, to get links to everything I've told you, including transcripts of each episode, links to sources and music used, etc. It's a one-stop shop for everything podcast-related. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I'll dive right back into the concluding episode of the series, based on the story of the Alcasser girls. Despite multiple confessions forming the framework of the prosecution's case against Miguel Ricart, the trial to decide his guilt did not start until May of 1997, over 4 years after he was originally detained. One of the major reasons for this delay was because of what I have talked about in the past, and that is DNA testing. The jump in technology was now allowing the forensics teams to test more and more evidence, including the hair follicles discovered on the bodies and the rug in which the girls were buried. In part 3, I told you about the 15 individual hairs that were recovered from the bodies of the 3 victims. These 15 hairs were tested against DNA of Miguel Ricart and Antonio Inglis, which police had on file. None of the hairs were a match for either man, not a single one. 12 of the hairs were definitively not a match, while 3 of the remaining hairs were unable to be tested, because of either damage done to the hairs or contamination. Either way, you would think that this would surely set back the prosecution in their efforts to convict Miguel Ricart, right? Wrong. They continued with the trial, despite still having no murder weapon, crime scene, or forensic evidence linking their lone suspect to the assault. His trial would get started in May of 1997, but something else would happen beforehand. On Friday, May 9th, 1997, Fernando Garcia, the father of one of the victims, Miriam Garcia Iborra, requested a delay in the start of the trial. This came just days before the trial was set to begin, but Fernando pled with the courts to delay the trial to allow further DNA testing. At this point, Fernando had gotten involved with noted criminologist and true crime author Juan Ignacio Blanco, who had hosted talk shows dedicated to criminal cases and worked on articles for various newspapers and magazines. Juan Ignacio Blanco had begun investigating the case of the Alcasser girls as part of his job, but soon the case would dominate the lives of both him and Fernando Garcia. As you may remember from part 1 of the series, Fernando had given up his day job after the girls went missing to formulate their search. By the time the girls' bodies were found, 75 days later, Fernando had been traveling internationally to spread their story to anyone who was willing to listen. 4 years later, he was even further entrenched in the case. His wife, Miriam's mother, Matilda Iborra, noted that Fernando spent more nights at hotels than he did at home, and that their marriage was a shell of what it had once been. Now, in 1997, their marriage was on the rocks, and Matilda herself was knocking on death's door. The mother of Miriam had been battling liver cancer for a couple of years at this point. She was even on the list for organ donors, but at some point in 1997, decided to remove her name from the list, because she wished the organ to go to someone that, in her words, wanted to live. Despite his personal life falling apart, Fernando would not give up his fight for the truth. He had been pushing the case for years now, and with the trial so close, he wanted to make sure that there was no mistake or miscalculation. He believed that prosecuting Miguel Ricart alone for the various crimes was both a mistake and a miscalculation. So now, just days before the trial was set to begin, you had the father of one of the victims asking for a delay. Fernando wanted to make sure that the police had exhausted every possible avenue before proceeding with a criminal trial. That, and he had started to doubt the official police report. In September of 1996, Fernando Garcia had gained access to the police case files, which detailed the investigation from beginning to end. Sharing those case files with Juan Ignacio Blanco, an esteemed criminologist in his own right, the two began to understand the intricacies of the case. By that, I mean they realized that the police really had nothing on Miguel Ricart, other than some circumstantial evidence that didn't amount to much, and confessions that Miguel claims were coerced. Fernando Garcia had been pushing to not only delay the trial, but broaden the scope of the investigation. He did not believe that Miguel Ricart and Antonio Inglis had acted alone in the crime. He was still unsure of their guilt or innocence, but theorized that they were simply part of something bigger. Perhaps they were patsies, set up to look guilty, or even gophers for a larger criminal enterprise, who had kidnapped the girls and delivered them to more prominent figures. Either way, Fernando Garcia was confident that police were not looking at the whole story, so he spared no expense in trying to reveal that to the world, figuratively speaking. In the months between January and July of 1997, Fernando appeared on various television and radio programs, often accompanied by Juan Ignacio Blanco. The two spoke freely about their ideas on the case, that there were higher-ups in the government involved, perhaps even elected officials or members of law enforcement, They went on to accuse specific people, politicians and esteemed members of the community, some of whom had been dogged by rumors of wrongdoing for years. Fernando even accused 4 members of the Spanish Civil Guard for being inept. These were the 4 members who had exhumed the bodies from the burial site at La Romana. Fernando stated that they lost evidence that was vital to the case. Fernando even accused the chief prosecutor, Enrique Beltran, of being lazy and complacent. He claimed that Beltran only went after Miguel Ricart because he did not care. This caused quite a stir among the community, and even led to ramifications later on for both Fernando and Juan Ignacio Blanco. Through his allegations, Fernando Garcia found himself splitting the families of the 3 victims into 3 different camps. The parents of Tony Gomez Rodriguez supported his endeavor to delay the trial and gather up more forensic evidence, but remained pretty neutral. You can tell throughout the entire investigation that they wanted to remain in the background and not put themselves in the spotlight. However, the parents of Desiree Hernandez Folch were less than forthcoming with Fernando Garcia's wishes. Rosa Folch believed that the police had the right of it, and that Miguel Ricard, who had now been in prison for over 4 years, should have his day in court immediately. When Fernando Garcia decided to form a fundraising campaign in July of 1997, called Girls of Alcasser, Rosa Folch fought against it. She did not want her daughter's image or likeness to be tied to Fernando's parallel research, and demanded that he cease this fundraising effort. He actually did, but continued researching the case on his own dime, alongside Juan Ignacio Blanco. When Blanco published a book in 1998, Rosa Folch became a critic of that as well. But that's a story I'll get to a bit later in the episode, as that book would go on to become a dramatic story of its own. The main reason that Fernando Garcia wanted to delay the trial was because of new information brought up by Dr. Luis Frontella Carreras. Dr. Frontella had noted that the piece of carpeted material that the girls were buried in, which I've often referred to as a rug, contained untested DNA. This meant that there looked to be smears of blood and semen on the rug, none of which had been tested forensically. As I've mentioned before, this time period saw DNA testing evolve significantly. At the time the bodies of the 3 girls were found, it was a relatively obscure technology. Now, it was cutting edge, working its way into many high-profile criminal cases and becoming what it is today. That is, the hallmark of a foolproof investigation. Dr. Frontella had been unable to test the carpet for any bodily fluids before this time period, because the technology just wasn't there. Now, however, he was begging the courts to give him time to test the rug, by delaying the trial for at least a few months. However, his appeal would fall on deaf ears. The following Monday, May 12th, would see Miguel Ricart finally seeing the inside of a courtroom, over 4 years after originally being detained. When Miguel Ricart had first been detained by the Spanish Civil Guard on January 27, 1993, he had only been 23 years old. His criminal career was a blip on the radar of police, having been arrested a couple of times for petty crimes such as auto theft. That being said, he had done 2 stints in jail for these crimes, which were each just a week or 2 long. Now, however, he was closer to 30, his youth gradually disappearing as he awaited trial for the murders of the 3 Alcasser victims. To his credit, his stay in various Spanish jails and prisons had been a pretty tame one. I can't imagine what 4 years in indefinite detainment can do to someone, but all of the people that worked around Miguel called him congenial. He had not gotten in trouble for any fights, skirmishes, or any bad behavior. In fact, the mental evaluation performed by Dr. Francisco Ross Plaza, and briefly mentioned in Part 4 of this series, referred to Miguel's overall nature as timid. This pleasant nature of Miguel's would go on to work against him in the trial. The trial was presided over by Mariano Tomás Benítez, a noted judge who had been a part of major legislative and criminal proceedings since the 1970s. The prosecution, led by Enrique Beltran, brought Miguel's nature into question during the trial. They stated that he had acted as an accomplice to Antonio Inglis, the main perpetrator. His do-nothing nature and various confessions were proof of that, they claimed. In his confessions, he had constantly stated that he was acting on the orders of Antonio, and he was simply too frightened to question him. Unfortunately, his behavior since proved that he was very good at following orders. The prosecution also brought other factors of Miguel's past into question: his troubled relationship with his father, the early death of his mother, his constant moving around, his drug habits, etc. All of it came into play, into what is still one of the most notorious criminal trials in Spanish history. Throughout the police investigation and following trial, Miguel Ricart's legal team had resembled something like a revolving door. As always, please forgive me for any terrible pronunciations. When he had first been arrested, he had been given a public defender. Her name was Ana Bayet Diato. However, just a day later, his attorney became Vicente Sanchez Ruggiara. Then, yet again, his legal team changed a day later. Joaquin Comins Tello became his lawyer, and would go on to defend Miguel Ricart over the next year or so. There is no reason given for this constant legal turnover, but it's worth noting that these were the three lawyers present during Miguel's various confessions. His first lawyer had been appointed even after Miguel signed his voluntary and first statements refusing any legal help. On November 23, 1993, Miguel Ricard had petitioned the courts for his lawyer, Joaquin Comins Tello, to resign. The reason had been a lack of trust between the lawyer and client. A year later, in November of 1994, Miguel had repeated this petition on the grounds that his lawyer did not have enough experience to mount a legal defense on behalf of Miguel. A year later, in November of 1994, Miguel had repeated this petition, this time on the grounds that his lawyer did not have enough experience to mount a legal defense on behalf of Miguel. The court granted this request. After all, the baseline in Spain was that a lawyer must have at least 5 years' experience in criminal cases when defending a client who faced over 6 years in prison. Over the next few years, this constant turnover would continue. 7 lawyers would come and go, Miguel petitioning for their resignation for matters relating to trust or experience in handling criminal cases. His final lawyer, Manuel Lopez Almanza, was appointed on January 27, 1997. This was almost 4 years after the discovery of the bodies, and just 4 months before one of the biggest trials in Spanish history would begin. There was also a substitute lawyer appointed, just in case Lopez Almanza was forced to step down for any reason. Thankfully, though, he did not step down. But unfortunately for Miguel, his new defense might not have been as well prepared as a longer tenured attorney would have been for a trial of this scope. Because in the 4 months that Lopez Almanza was Miguel's primary attorney, he would have to sift through over 8,000 documents pertaining to the trial, including countless expert opinions, Miguel's own confessions, any pieces of evidence, and the police files themselves, which had now been building up for half a decade. The trial lasted almost 3 months. Records show that the various parties met for 14 days in May, 15 days in June, and 20 days in July. Miguel's defense, led by Manuel Lopez Almanza, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's logic. There was still no physical evidence putting Miguel Ricart at the crime scene, and the very inclusion of Antonio Inglis into their narrative was disputed. After all, there was no evidence that Miguel had been involved in the crimes, and even less that Antonio Inglis had been. He had not been spotted by officials since March of 1992, 8 months before the 3 victims were murdered. The defense pointed to other possibilities. Early reports, made just days after the girls had gone missing from Alcasser, pointed to an unknown group of suspects in the town of Silla. Silla was just a few kilometers east of Alcasser, and some early news reports made in the weeks after the girls originally disappeared tied them to a group of older men from Silla. In fact, the day that the bodies of the 3 girls were found also came with the news that police had arrested a 40-year-old man for his involvement in the crime. This news has never been verified, and police never publicly stated the identity of the man, because the news of Miguel Ricart's confession came just a day later. However, the same newspaper report also claimed that this 40-year-old man had turned over the names of 5 other suspects, which is a very specific piece of information for a newspaper to report with very little substance. The defense also pointed out that the only evidence tying Miguel to the crime, originally, was a pamphlet from a nearby hospital with the name of Enrique Inglis. If you recall, this pamphlet was never confirmed to have been found inside the pit of the 3 victims, simply nearby the pit. No videos or photographs were taken of the evidence being compiled at the crime scene. Instead, the first responders had grouped the evidence together into a single frame and photographed it there. The argument of the defense was that no piece of paper, whether it was found at or around the burial spot of the 3 girls, would have simply remained in one spot. People have actually gone out to this area in the years since, and tried to see how far pieces of paper can travel in the hills of La Romana. After 3 months, almost all of the papers have gone missing or been found a great distance away. It was unlikely that this pamphlet would have been found at the crime scene if it was originally placed there by the suspects. Nonetheless, the pamphlet belonged to Enrique Inglis, who was not facing 200 years in prison for the rape, torture, and murder of the 3 Alcasser victims. One issue presented in the trial was the autopsy videos presented behind closed doors. The video of the first autopsy was presented without sound, at the insistence of Dr. Luis Frontella Carreras, the trial's forensic expert. The video of this autopsy had also been condensed to roughly 20 minutes. This was a multi-hour procedure, mind you, involving 3 victims, and only 20 minutes was shown as evidence. This also happened to be the botched autopsy, which had mishandled evidence and been very poorly performed. Then, the video of the second autopsy was presented, which seemed to be just as marred as the video of the first. This was despite the autopsy being much more professionally handled. Reports surfaced that much of the video was fast-forwarded, and several parts seemed to be repeats of the first autopsy tape. That being said, much of the information I've just told you is secondhand, passed on by those that were behind those closed doors to witness the videos. However, it is odd that several hours of the autopsies were not recorded, and/or not presented as evidence. After all, the autopsies made up almost all of the physical evidence. Without them, the prosecution had very little to go off of. Enrique Beltran brought in Miguel's various confessions, and used them to illuminate just how untrustworthy Miguel was. His statements had continued to change, Miguel seeming to have something new to add in every incarnation. Miguel stated openly that the confessions were coerced, and that the civil guard had threatened both him and his daughter. But that seemed to have very little impact on the judge deciding his sentence. The trial concluded on July 30th, 1997. The public waited on bated breath to discover Miguel Ricart's fate, which took over a month to come to light. 36 days later, on September 5th, 1997, Magistrate Mariano Tomas Benitez handed down a sentence of 170 years for Miguel Ricart after his guilt was proven by the prosecution. The various offenses he was found guilty for were kidnap, murder, rape, sexual assault, illicit possession of a firearm, and covering up the murder. Miguel Ricart now had to resign himself to never again seeing the outside world. The lengthy sentence, written by Magistrate Tomas Benitez, also went out of its way to condemn the efforts of Miriam's father, Fernando Garcia, in trying to delay the trial and conduct a concurrent investigation to find more suspects. You see, as I described in the first part of this episode, Fernando had started to become an open critic of the investigation. After getting access to the police files in the latter half of 1996, he had become aware of just how little evidence the police had against Miguel Ricart. This trial, in which they had thrown every possible shred of evidence at Miguel Ricart's guilt, proved that to Fernando. His alliance with Juan Ignacio Blanco, the noted criminologist and true crime author, would not end anytime soon. On the contrary, Fernando passed on the police files to Juan Ignacio Blanco to use for an upcoming tell-all about the case. The book, called What Happened in Alcasser, was published in May of 1998, less than a year after the conviction of Miguel Ricart. The book became an incredibly divisive issue, as it included details found in the police case files, including photos of the 3 bodies, various points of evidence that had not been publicly released, and it also stood as a harsh critique of the prosecution's case. Rosa Folch, the mother of the victim Desiree, had been a critic of Fernando Garcia's for a couple of years at this point. She had fought against him using her daughter's likeness for fundraising efforts, and upon the release of this book, filed a lawsuit against the author, Juan Ignacio Blanco. In August of 1998, the Spanish government got involved, ordering all copies of the book to be withdrawn and destroyed. Surprisingly, you could still find some copies out there online. I was hoping to have a version available for the making of this series, but alas, trying to find a translated version of a 700-page book is a daunting task. Maybe one day. Anyhow, one has to question why the Spanish government felt the need to get so heavy-handed with the ban on this book. After all, there was no court case to decide the fate of the book. Rumors have constantly followed Rosa Folch that she settled with Juan Ignacio Blanco for a monetary sum, but has not disclosed the amount. In 2000, 2 years after the book had been pulled from shelves, Juan Ignacio Blanco was sentenced to pay a fine of nearly $1 million Spanish because of allegations he had made against the chief prosecutor, Enrique Beltran. In addition to the fine, he also had to pay $1 million to Beltran himself. Beltran would later claim to have donated the proceeds to fundraising efforts in the area. Outside of the infighting, the parents of the 3 victims struggled to move on after the brutal murders of their daughters. Fernando Garcia, who had been appointed as the unofficial spokesman of the victims' families and fought against the trial of Miguel Ricart, was widowed just a year after the trial. His wife, Matilda Iborra, passed away in 1998 from liver cancer. He went on to continue his professional career, establishing a successful mattress business in Alcasser, and he would raise his 2 sons alone. Eventually, he would go on to remarry, and even had another daughter named Lucia. Rosa Folch, the mother of Desiree, also found herself widowed. In June of 1994, the year after the bodies of the 3 girls were found, Desiree's father, Vicente Hernandez, passed away. Fernando Gomez and Luisa Rodriguez, the parents of Tony, have refrained from the spotlight. They originally backed Fernando Garcia's efforts to delay the trial and test more evidence, but eventually turned away entirely. They kept a large portrait of Tony in their living room for the rest of the world to see and remember, but they did not want to drag their family through the mud of public statements. Tony's father, Fernando, would later be quoted as saying, "Money does not fix anything," which was due to a lawsuit being filed on behalf of the 3 families. The lawsuit, filed by Rosa Folch in 2005, was aimed at the state for allowing Antonio Inglis his 6-day pass to leave prison in March of 1992. Without that pass, he would not have been able to commit the crime against the 3 victims. And despite wanting to avoid the lawsuit, the state had used Antonio Inglis as a scapegoat in the trial of Miguel Ricard, so they were forced to pay up. Each family received over 300,000 euros from the state, but it was nothing compared to their daughters lost. Sadly, for Fernando Garcia, it was just a drop in the bucket. As I told you, in 1997, Fernando Garcia had launched a media campaign alongside Ignacio Blanco to broaden the scope of the investigation. Throughout this campaign, the 2 pointed their fingers at multiple public figures for being involved in a cult of sorts. At the risk of attracting unwanted attention, I won't name these figures, but they included several noted politicians and businessmen in the Spanish area. Fernando Garcia and Juan Ignacio Blanco named these figures specifically on national television. And these weren't just regional politicians. They included civil governors, secretaries of state, CEOs, ranking officials in the Spanish Civil Guard, and more. The 2 alleged that Miguel Ricard may have been involved in this group, as a henchman of sorts. Perhaps he picked up the girls, or was responsible for disposing of their bodies, but he most definitely did not act alone. They also theorized that Antonio Inglis, known in Catalonia as a drug dealer, was likely involved in procuring the girls, but overstayed his welcome at some point. They believed that his entire getaway, traveling across Spain and Portugal to stow away aboard a ship, was a fabrication on behalf of the Spanish government. This story would even take a further turn when Juan Ignacio Blanco began speaking openly about a supposed snuff tape made of the 3 victims. This video was apparently given to the noted author by a pastor in Alcasser, who had also made contact with Miriam's father, Fernando Garcia. According to these 2, the pastor had apparently spoken to someone involved with the crime who felt guilt in the years after. The emergence of this snuff tape also happens to coincide with a 1999 letter sent to the Spanish media, decrying the entire trial as a hoax. This video apparently contains clear images of Desiree Hernandez Folch being tortured and murdered by at least 4 identifiable individuals, who Juan Ignacio Blanco claims have been previously rumored to be involved in the crime. Ignacio Blanco has claimed to have provided a copy of the tape to the Spanish Minister of the Interior to no avail. If this video does exist, one has to wonder why nothing has come out of it. Of course, the Spanish media has done a pretty good job of painting Juan Ignacio Blanco as a crazed conspiracy theorist, and Fernando Garcia along with him. It is very likely that we'll never uncover the truth of these theories, although Juan Ignacio Blanco has threatened to release the video in a format that would allow him to escape legal trouble. Whether this would be via the darknet is unknown, but the rumors of the snuff tape have continued to fuel fire that there is a conspiracy behind the murder of the 3 victims. In June of 2009, after years of various allegations and theories, Fernando Garcia and Juan Ignacio Blanco found themselves in hot water once again. The two were prominent figures in a television documentary about the trial of Miguel Ricard. Throughout the documentary, they had made allegations against the chief prosecutor, Enrique Beltran, stating that he had conspired with higher-ups to sink the case. They also stated that the prosecution had developed tunnel vision on Miguel Ricard almost immediately, and they had not done their due diligence with the case. Fernando Garcia was sentenced to pay almost 300,000 euros to various individuals. 4 civil guard members received 30,000 euros each. 4 forensic doctors received the same amount, and Enrique Beltran himself got 30,000 euros, along with a tally accrued in legal fines for Fernando. For his part in collaborating with Fernando Garcia and publicizing the theories in his own works, Juan Ignacio Blanco not only received the same harsh fines and financial obligations, but was sentenced to 2 years in prison for spreading theories about the prosecution. The prosecution had originally tried to convict both on 16-year sentences, but the jury was lenient on both. These sentences have gone on to further muddy the waters around the investigation, which many view as being open and shut from the very beginning. The only 2 real figures to critique the opinion of the civil guard and the prosecution found themselves facing debilitating fines and prison time. Many view it as a very stoic, cruel statement by the Spanish government, that if you critique the official narrative, you'll face the same just reward. Nonetheless, Juan Ignacio Blanco has not refrained from his accusations in the years since. Despite his prison sentence, he has remained a noted criminologist, and he even founded his own website for archiving criminal activities. You may have heard of it actually. It's the website Murderpedia, where the records of killers and murderers are archived and stored for public use. As recent as 2013, Ignacio Blanco has continued to speak openly about the snuff video in his possession, apparently showing the torture and murder of Desiree Hernandez Folch. He states that it's not something he talks about lightly. He said watching the video was a turning point in his life, and it's something that changed him remarkably. He wants to release it to force the Spanish government to act upon it, but he is simply handcuffed as to how. Only time will tell whether or not the work of Ignacio Blanco and Fernando Garcia will go on to effect any change. They have each put their blood, sweat, and tears into finding out the truth of who killed the 3 Alcasser victims, but accomplished nothing other than regional publicity and financial setbacks. Believe it or not, the story is not yet over. More was to come in 2013, including the release of Miguel Ricart. Before I tell you how Miguel Ricart became a free man, I need to take a moment to briefly explain the Pero Doctrine. As you may know, Spain is part of the European Union, which has several laws and rules about terms of imprisonment. Basically, for decades, the longest that a Spanish prisoner could feasibly spend in prison was 30 years. But in the 1990s, after the conviction of a terrorist named Henry Pero, Spain reserved the right for violent offenders to spend their entire term in jail. For Miguel Ricart, this meant that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. After all, he was given a 170-year sentence. But in 2013, a Spanish prisoner took this case to the ranking European courts, which actually ruled against Spain. Basically, they stated that physically holding a prisoner for longer than 30 years was considered cruel and unusual punishment. Without any end in sight for a sentence, prisoners could become unruly, violent, and cruel to not only each other, but the staff responsible for their well-being. This meant that, in October of 2013, Spain had a pretty big issue on their hands. Not only were hundreds of violent prisoners immediately due for release, but they had to begin working out a plan to slowly and safely ensure their individual releases. Miguel Ricart was one of those prisoners due for release. He had been in prison for over 20 years, his formerly youthful appearance, with chiseled jaw and full head of hair, making way for a stout, balding, bearded man. Stepping out into freedom for the first time in nearly 21 years, Miguel Ricart became a free man on November 29, 2013. He wore a white jacket with a balaclava covering up his facial appearance, and he was greeted outside of jail, not by friends or family, but by a legion of journalists who wanted the first words from his mouth. He refused to speak to any of them, instead making his way to a nearby train station, using some of the earnings he had made working in prison, roughly 2,000 euros. He took a train to a nearby town, getting off before his ticketed destination. From there, he got off into a car with two unknown individuals who waited for him. Miguel recorded a single phone interview with a news station the day after his release, in which he stated that he was innocent of the crimes he was convicted of. He decried the crimes against the three teenage victims as an outrage, and he accused the prosecution of setting him up. Miguel did not face a warm reception upon his release. Weeks after leaving prison, he had only made one public statement, that phone interview, and he was struggling to get by. After all, he had spent half of his life behind bars, and he was now considered one of the most hated men in Spain. People turned him away from their establishments, and he faced sneers and insults every time he was recognized. His daughter, who was an infant when he went to prison, still hasn't had a relationship with him. Despite all of this, that his face had been plastered over Spanish media for the past 2 decades, Miguel has himself stayed off the grid in the years since. It has been almost 4 years since his release from prison, and no one really knows where he is. Rumors have stated that he had found religion in prison, and he has dedicated his life to working in a French monastery, where judgment is reserved for God above. The murders of Tony Gomez Rodriguez, Desiree Hernandez Folch, and Miriam Garcia Iborra are technically considered solved. But even so, one of the main suspects is free from his sentence, and the other has not been officially seen in over 25 years. The evidence left behind with the bodies of the 3 victims points to a narrative not explored by the prosecution. As I've mentioned, there were 15 hairs found with the 3 bodies. DNA testing compared these hairs to both Miguel Ricart and Antonio Inglis, but 12 hairs came back as negative matches. The other 3 hairs were inconclusive, having been damaged. However, the 12 hairs that were tested point to at least 7 different individuals, all of whose DNA was not in the Spanish Civil Guard's forensic database. This has not been followed through on, simply because the case file is technically already solved. Antonio Inglis is a fugitive as far as Valencian courts are concerned, and he is the only one suspected of further involvement in the murders of the 3 Alcasser victims. In the decades since the murder, fingers have been pointed at various figures and organizations. Every time a pedophile ring is broken up in Spain, theorists online point to it as being endemic of Spain's seedy underbelly, of which the rape, torture, and murder of the 3 Alcasser victims is just a symptom. Only time will tell whether or not the full story will ever get revealed. Just as it was 20 years ago, many still cling to the belief that Miguel Ricart and Antonio Inglis acted alone in the abduction and murder of the 3 victims. However, the evidence has shown that more men are involved, regardless of the story the prosecution framed their case around. Because of that, and the fact that both Miguel Ricart and Antonio Inglis are currently unaccounted for, this story remains unresolved. Well, if you're still listening to the podcast at this point, I honestly cannot thank you enough. The Alcasser story was an undertaking I never really anticipated me actually going on. I mean, 99% of the sources I used were written in Spanish, which is a language, surprisingly, I know nothing about. The Alcasser story, while tragic, is also full of so many crazy twists and turns that I couldn't help but split it into so many parts. For what it's worth, I could have easily made a 10-part series, but I don't think my brain could handle another month of Google translated documents and case files. before I wrap up this series for good, I want to just give a few shoutouts. First, of course, to Tyson Nordgren, who has done an amazing job of putting together most of the music throughout the series. He's also fixed some of my production blunders, so major props, Tyson. Thank you. Secondly, to all of the Patreon supporters who have jumped on board over the past couple of months. Support for the podcast has grown quite a bit, and I'd personally mention all of you if my throat wasn't so sore at the moment. Recording this episode has seriously taken over 3 hours. Finally, to you, the listener. Just listening to the podcast is amazing. You honestly have no idea how much I appreciate you listening to my little rinky-dink podcast, which is growing in size every single day. Thank you for doing your part. You have no idea how much I love each and every one of you. If you would like to stay in touch with the podcast, either to drown me in praise or critique my terrible Spanish pronunciations, you could do so in a variety of ways. The podcast can be found at theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, or you could send me a personal email at michael@unresolved.me. That's Micheal with the E before the A. Blame my parents, not me. The podcast can also be found at Unresolved Pod on both Facebook and Twitter. That's just Unresolved Pod, no spaces or slashes or anything like that. Lastly, if you'd like to support the podcast, just leave us a review on your podcast app of choice, or head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. You've heard that spiel before. Everything about the podcast, including everything I have and have not said in this episode, can be found at unresolved.me. So if you want to find out anything, just head there. Once again, that's unresolved.me. I'm not quite sure which story I'll be diving into next, but I've had a few in the works for a while now, so I'm pretty eager to get into those. Not quite sure when the next episode will be out, as I'm going to be moving over the next couple of weeks, but I promise that it won't be too long from now. Until then, everyone, stay safe. Talk to you later.